Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. And in this video, what I want to do is talk about how AJAX and API calls and fetch, and just do sort of a masterclass and sort of like what's going on here. So let's just kind of start off with sort of like where HTML, CSS, and JavaScript sort of began. In the beginning, you have a HTML page. So let's create one. So let's say index.html. Okay, I will put my HTML boilerplate in there, and I will open this up with Live Server. And there it is. Now, basically, I could have content on this page. So we'll say like h1, hello world. Okay, and basically, in order for me to interact with other things, okay, as far as like requesting other resources, there's very few ways that were originally built in to do that. Like, I could bring in like a picture using an image tag. So I could say, hey, image, source, and then we'll just go grab some random image. So go to images.google.com, and I'll just look up a random image of cheese. Okay, so there's some cheese. Copy image address, and we'll say, hey, the source equals that. Okay, and then there we'll have an image there. Okay, and then what I'll do is I'll just style that real quick, just so that way it's not so big. So style, we'll say with 200 pixels. Okay, so I could, and essentially what's going to happen is that when that HTML page loads, so if I open here and I click inspect, there's a section of DevTools called Network, and this kind of shows you all the different requests that your page is making. So if I were to refresh this, you'll see originally we make the request for the index.html page, and it reads the HTML. Now, as it reads the HTML, it's going to try to load up other things. So you see right here is like the picture of the cheese. Okay, so that's the request for the cheese, and then there's just some other stuff that has to do with Live Server. So the point is, I'm able to request an external resource through the image tag, specifically a picture. Now, what if I want to request like another page? Okay, well, there's two ways I can do this. I could use a link. So first I would need another HTML page. So let's just say, okay, cheese.html. Okay, and then I'll just do an exclamation point, and we'll just put an h1 in here that says cheese. Okay. Now, what I could do is I could use a link tag. So I would say, hey, A, also known as an anchor tag. And then I say, hey, link to, and we'll just say /cheese.html. Okay, because it's in the same folder. Okay, and then anything in between the A tag, okay, go to cheese would be a link. Okay, and so we see right there, go to cheese. So if I click on that, see, it takes me to the cheese page. Okay, because the link will request that specific resource. Okay, it does what's called a GET request to get the thing. That's fine, I can do that. And then the only other way to do a request was a form. Okay, so I could use a link, which will always get things, or I could use a form. And with a form, I could first specify where it's going to make a request to. Okay, so I could say form/action. And then the action is essentially the same thing as href. It's just like, where is this request going to? So let's say /cheese.html again. Okay. And then you would have method, which will determine what kind of request. By default, it's going to do a GET request. So by default, it's a GET request. Okay, and here I have a form. Okay, and then here we'll have like we'll just have one button that says go to cheese again. And this will essentially do the same thing. So if I go back to that main page, refresh, okay, you see this button that says go to cheese. Because the button is inside of a form, when I click this button, it's treated as a submission of the form, and it's going to make a request to this page using this method. Okay, so I can click go to cheese, and it's just going to take me to the cheese page again. So it's essentially a glorified link. Okay. And the only cool thing about the form is that now I can do a different method called post. And if I change it to post, it's going to, well, in this case, it's going to fail. So if I do this, I get, well, it kind of worked. but that's just because of the way live server works. But theoretically, it's going to make a post request to that URL, and that server is going to handle that request however it handles a post request. So this gives you the flexibility to now do get and post. Post usually you would use to like add things, basically whenever you submit data to a server. But that was it. Essentially, those were the two options you had to make a request to sort of external things. Okay, so essentially I could either always make a get request with a link, an A tag, or I could make get or post requests with a form. And that was it. Okay, now what if I have data in some sort of form? So for example, maybe I have what's called a JSON file. So in this case, we'll say, actually what I'll do is I'll use Bard. Okay, and we'll have it generate some JSON data for us. Okay, so do this for me. Generate me a JSON. Generate me JSON data on 80s TV shows. Okay, so it's going to generate some data. Okay, nope, it's giving it to me just the raw data. I want to give it to me. Give me the raw JSON. Okay, because that's what I want. I want the raw JSON. Yay for, new technology like AI or LLMs more specifically. Okay. Okay, so usually that would work just fine, but I guess not. So we'll try ChatGPT. Okay. Give me a raw JSON code block of data from 80s TV shows. Okay, and hit enter. Let it generate the thing. This is fine. Perfect. But it's only one TV show. Can you give me an array of 10 shows? Okay, just want a nice little data set that we can work with. Okay, so it's going to generate that. So I'll give it a second to generate that. Cool. So this is known as JSON data. So you notice that basically the format of this data looks a lot like a JavaScript object. And essentially it is. The difference is that like a JavaScript object is actually like a data structure in the runtime of your programming, while JSON is just text. It's just text that is a way of just showing data as text. Okay. So let me just copy this. I'm going to create a file called JSON. So we'll just call this 80s.json. And I will just paste this data in there. Okay, and there it is. So we got this JSON data. That's not the only kind of data there could be. I mean, theoretically, I could also have like we'll just say data.xml. You could have data as XML. We're not going to really work with XML data right now because XML data is not as used as it once was. Let me show you why. Okay, so for example, if I were creating like an array of dogs, I would have like dogs, and this would represent an array because it represents multiple dogs. Inside dogs, there'd be many individual dogs. We'll say each dog has a name. So we'll say Fido. And each dog has an age. We'll say 7. And then there would be like many dogs in that dog's, and then that would essentially be an example of like how you would send data, represent data in text as XML. Now we kind of moved away from XML because it's really redundant. I'm writing dogs twice. I'm writing dog twice for each individual dog. So there's a lot of repetition of text. So you end up doubling or, really expanding the size of the data you're sending over. Okay. So that's why generally we use JSON now, because JSON, you're not repeating that. Like for title, I'm not writing title twice. And I don't even need a tag to represent, hey, 80s TV shows. I just have square brackets to represent the list. Okay, so it's much more compact. Okay, so to kind of get back to the point here is that we have ways that we can represent data that we'd like to use on our websites, and I'd like to be able to request it. Okay, and JSON is a very popular way of doing that. Okay, so I could use a link to go access that JSON data. So if I go back here and I create another link, a href equals slash 80s.json. I could link to that file, 80s data. And I go back to the main page, refresh. There's the 80s data, and it'll take me to the JSON data. So here's the JSON data. Now, if this is the first time you're working with JSON data, the way it would look for you is like this, like just raw text. I have a special Chrome extension. There's plenty of them called JSON Prettifier. So it could be like, there's like JSONify. There's a whole bunch of different Chrome extensions that'll help you when you look at JSON, make it look a lot nicer so you can explore that JSON more effectively. And I can see all the different individual objects in that JSON. So when I look at this and I collapse it, I can see that this is an array of 10 objects. And it just makes it easier for me to look through my data, and I can just go ahead and open up one object at a time, see what data's in there. I can explore my data. But I don't want to just look at the data as JSON. I don't want to just treat that JSON data as a separate thing I'm loading up separately. And that's what generally A tags do. They're going to basically replace the current page with whatever document you link to. Okay? And then forms, if it's a GET request, are going to do the same thing. And if it's a POST request, it's going to expect some server to handle it. What if I just want to go fetch the data so I can use it on the page that I'm on? There really wasn't a way to do that until AJAX came along, okay, which stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Okay, cool. Okay, so even if we haven't touched AJAX yet, hopefully this kind of sets the logical stage for what's going on here. Okay, so let's actually see this at work. So in the early stages of AJAX, there was something called XML request, XML, I think it's HTML request, yeah, or HTTP request, there we go. Okay, and this is this object here. Okay, we're not going to go over this because this is generally a pain to use, okay, but this was the way you would normally, in the original days, create a request for like third-party data. Okay, let me see if I can find a request, an example. But essentially, this would like set up the whole stage for me creating a request. Okay, and there was a lot of steps, and it was really tricky to work with. So what happened is that jQuery, which was a huge library at the time, basically made it a lot easier to work with these. Okay, so again, I can add jQuery by adding the jQuery script tag to my HTML document. And so I'll add jQuery right here. So now what I can do is in my JavaScript, instead of having to create this whole XML HTTP request abstraction, okay, I can use this AJAX function that's built into jQuery. So I would just sit there and say, hey, $.ajax, and then I would just put the URL of where I'm requesting data from. Okay, so in this case, I'm requesting data from /80s.json. Okay, now these functions, now when you're requesting data from a third-party website, or it's assuming that it's possible to be a third-party website, you don't know where we're requesting data from, it doesn't know when that data is going to get returned. So it has to be handled asynchronously, meaning, hey, well, that is, well, you go ask that place for the thing, we should be able to do other stuff. It's kind of like ordering pizza. When I order pizza, that pizza's not going to show up right away. So what do? I order the pizza, I call up the pizza place, that pizza's on the way, and I go do other things while the pizza is being prepared and brought over. Okay, and that's how asynchronous promises work in JavaScript. So whenever a function returns a promise, like this AJAX function, it's a special object in type JavaScript. I have a separate video on how promises work that I highly recommend watching to fill in those gaps. But generally, when a promise is returned by a function, JavaScript just knows, hey, that might not come here right away, so I'm going to go do other things while that promise finishes. So in this case, my JavaScript will keep running past this line while it waits for that promise to finish. Okay? And so this JavaScript is going to return the promise, which will contain the response. So we'll say const response equals AJAX. So we're going to say, hey, we're going to go request the data from 80s.json, and we're going to save that in a variable called response. And just so we can double check that what it is, I'll say console.log response. Let's see what that response object is. Let me go back and open this up. Okay. And if we go back over here, the dev tools, I go to console. Okay, let me refresh the page. Well, let's go back to the main page here. Refresh. And see, we see this object here. Now, again, it's not exactly a promise because we're using jQuery. And jQuery kind of gives you something that's like a promise. Technically, it gives you kind of its own thing. But you see here, I get this object with a bunch of functions. Okay. And essentially, what happens is that this object is a wrapper around my request. It's basically saying, hey, I asked for some data from somewhere, and it doesn't know when I'm going to get there or when that data is going to come back. What I can do is I can say, hey, when the data comes back, what should I do? And that's what this then function's for. So now I can be like, hey, response.then, and then I write a function in here that receives the data. So it receives the data that was returned by the request. And then I can decide what I'm going to do with it in this function. So I can say, hey, so I get my response and then do this. So in this case, we'll console.log data. Okay. And if I console log the data, there it is. There's my array of 10 80 shows. And it's all nice and parsed as a JavaScript object. So I can go in there, loop over that array, then, put data on the screen. So this was a lot easier. This was really good. It's like, oh, okay, this is great. I love this. So eventually JavaScript said, like, we should just have that as part of JavaScript. So what they did is they created something called fetch, okay, which kind of works the same way. I would say const response equals fetch. Okay, it's right there built in the JavaScript. And recently Node has added fetch, and I think Deno has already had fetch from the get-go. So now fetch is pretty much everywhere you use JavaScript. So I can say fetch, and I want to go access that 80s.json file. Okay. And now, again, if I console.log response, let's take a look. See, now it's a promise object. So you can see now it actually has the word promise, and it says promise pending. Okay, because at that moment, the promise hasn't resolved yet. Okay, it has to do with the way promises work. Everything after the promise is returned is going to run first. So that's why you're going to see the pending. Although if I open this up, like if I were to actually unwrap this and take a look in there, I can actually find the data. So let's see here. Promise state fulfilled. Promise finally.then catch. Okay, here we go. Prototype response. And then here's where we find the data. Cool. So again, this isn't going to be the promise. Basically, the data is wrapped in that promise. So in that case, what I have to do is use .then. So again, you'll see here, there's that .then function again, which works the same way because it's the same function. So in that case, to unwrap the data from fetch, I use response.then. Okay, and again, that's going to give me back the response. We'll say res. But the thing is that fetch doesn't just give you back the data. If I console.log what we got back, res, okay, I'll notice, hey, that's not the JavaScript data. That's not the JSON data. Instead, I get the special object that's part of the JavaScript standard, the JavaScript browser standard, called a response object. And the nice thing about this response object is that it's a wrapper around the end data. Okay, so essentially that promise was a wrapper around the response, and the response is actually going to be the wrapper around the actual data from the API call. But the nice thing about this response object is going to have some extra data that I can use. So here's the body. That's where the actual data is going to be. Okay, and it comes in as a readable stream. Okay, which is not something I can. It's not something that I can use by itself, but it's something that I can turn into something useful. Okay, and over here there's headers. So if I want to take a look at the request headers, whether the request was successful, so I can see okay. So I can use that as an if statement to do error handling. Whether the request was redirected in case I wanted to handle that. What's the status code of the request? So there's all this extra information here that I can use to go back and do any additional error handling, whatnot, and work with the request. Okay, not gonna really worry about that now, but I might do something like, hey, if res.okay, which means the response was okay, was true, so the response was successful. Then you're gonna do X, else we'll say, throw, oops. Okay, so that means something went wrong. Cool. So I see I can use that OK property to kind of determine, hey, was this request successful? But now I want to get that data out of there though. So built into that readable stream, okay, are two methods. So in this case, there's two methods built into the response object. So actually, let me console log the response object again. Okay, and if we go in there, there's going to be two methods. And again, I can see these methods by going to the prototype of the response. And you can see it was actually a few. There's a bunch of methods. But the ones that are important to me are going to be text, okay, and JSON. Okay, there's also form data. This form data is more used if you want to go grab like let's say the response is from a form submission. You can grab the form data that way, or if you want to clone this thing, or if it's binary. So like let's say you grab the picture, like and it's a file is binary. You can use this blob to like process that binary. There's some extra stuff here, but the main two things, if you're grabbing like XML and JSON files, okay, you want the data just as text. Okay, you just want the text, which would be more useful if you're doing XML because you'd have to separately parse the XML. But I could take that res and then say, hey, res.text. Okay, and we'll call this const, final data. Okay, and basically what res.text is going to do, it's going to return, well, actually what you do is you would return res.text. Okay, so you're going to return that, but keep in mind, whenever you do a .then, if the function inside the .then returns a value, that value gets wrapped in a promise. So that means the result of res.text is going to get wrapped in a promise. So once again, we're going to want to do another .then to unwrap that promise. Okay. So what I can do is I can just chain off that promise and just do a .then right away. And then this .then would receive the actual data. Okay, so the data. And if I console.log data, see now I'm getting a string. So you can see here it's just printing this big JSON string. Okay, that's fine. Like if that's what you want, if all you want is the text of the thing, I'll show you some situations where that may be what you want. But more than likely, if you're getting back JSON data like you see here, then you rather use res.json. So in that case, you use res.json when you know that the response is JSON data, because then it'll automatically parse the JSON data and give it back to you as a JavaScript object or array. So now you see the data is actually a JavaScript construct, which I can then use to, I can then like loop over it. So I can be like for data.for each item. We'll just console log each item, console.log item. Okay, and you see now I've logged each item individually. Okay, and I can use that to loop over each item, then render it to the DOM. So I'll like create elements and paste them to the DOM. I can do that. Okay, and that's generally how you would work with JSON data and third-party APIs. Now, some third-party APIs require more than just the URL. Like you might have to access so the fetch function actually receives a second argument. So this fetch function actually receives a second argument that's an object. And generally here, you can do things like you can change what the method is. So we're going to do a get because we're still doing a get request. But theoretically, if I need to do post, and now you can go beyond post. If you want to do like delete or put request or also any kind of request you want, I can now specify the method. Okay, my request might need different headers. Okay, which are just different additional details that might be needed. Okay, so for example, I might be requesting from an API that requires authorization. So I might need an authorization header. Okay, that would look something like bear space, a token of some sort. Okay, and then that would authorize the request. Or I might be wanting to send data to the request. So I can say, hey, I want to send a body of data to the request. Okay, in which case, in my headers, I need to describe what the body is. So generally, in the headers, you would have a thing called content type. And then if it was JSON data, it would be application JSON would be the type. There's a bunch of them. I'm not going to go through every single one. Okay, for your content type headers. But then I can then submit some body. So we'll say, hey, like JSON.stringify. That's a function that turns a JavaScript object into a JSON string. I could say, hey, stringify this object. Hello, cheese. So it's going to take this object and turn it into a JSON string. And now, okay, and see, it's complaining because like a get request can't have a body. Okay, generally like get requests are just, I'm getting a thing, so I'm not submitting data. Has to be a post, put, or delete request, or actually really just a post or a put or patch request to include a body. So that's why that's why I'm getting that error here. Okay, but again, I can see these requests under network. So if I go to network, I can see that request that I made. So if I refresh this, okay, I'm not seeing that request because there's an error, but let me fix that. So let me just get rid of the body for a second. Okay, and see there's the request for 80s.json. Okay, so you see it right there. I can see, and then I can go to here, the headers, and I can explore all the details. I can see, hey, that was a request, that was a get method, a get request. I can take a look at what data came back. I can see, hey, look, this is the data that the request responded with. Okay. And this is generally very helpful for me to troubleshoot what's going on, because I can, again, take a look at each request my website's making and what it's for and how it's been handled. And oftentimes it's going to be a great place to determine problems when I'm having problems requesting data from third-party sources. Also, again, taking a look in your console for any errors here is also very helpful. So always make sure you're checking both. Okay, cool. But the cool thing is that it's not just JSON APIs you can request for. I could actually even request for HTML. This is kind of what a framework by the name of HTMX does. Okay, actually under the hood, it's just making requests and then swapping out HTML. Let me just show you an example of this. So let's say I were to create this like div.html. Okay, and in here there's going to be a div and an h1 that says hello world. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to my index.html. We'll put a place to put this. So we're going to put this right below the form. We're going to make another div called with an ID of target. Doesn't matter what the ID is. Okay, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another request. I'm going to do another fetch. So I'm going to say fetch. I'm just going to go get that, what was it, div.html. So slash div.html. Okay, then I'm going to chain that dot then after it. So that's going to be the response, res. And then let's just basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to then return. I don't need the HTML parsed as JSON because HTML is not JSON. So then in this case, I do just want the text. So I'm going to return res.text. Okay, and then again, that's going to, then I need to chain another dot then from there. And then this is going to be the, we'll say HTML. And again, if I console.log this, you'll see that I'm getting back the HTML. Okay, so see right there, you can see that this is the HTML div h1 hello world. So I can now use that. So what I can do is I can go grab that div. So I can say const target equals document dot query selector. Query selector, and then I want to get our thing that has the ID of target. And then what I want to do is I'm going to take that target and I'm going to change its inner HTML to equal that HTML variable. And see, now that div gets added to the page. Okay, that div wasn't there before. So basically what I'm saying is that using fetch, when instead of linking to another HTML file and that HTML file being replaced, so in this case, like if I link to div.html, so again, if I go back here and I create a link, href equals /div.html. Okay, and we'll say div. Okay, and I refresh the page. If I click here, see it replaces the HTML that was there with the different HTML file. That's the behavior of a link. But with fetch, I could just fetch the text of that HTML file and then swap it on the page. So this has become a paradigm that's become really popular lately with, again, frameworks like HTMX that makes this kind of thing really easy, where you don't even need to write all that JavaScript. I would let you go out there and learn HTMX. I'm not going to get into it right now, but essentially you can make it where it just swaps out chunks of HTML throughout your page instead of having to like render all this JSON data. Okay, but the point is, with fetch, you can just fetch any data from another file anywhere through creating these requests. And then you can interact with them. Again, you can go fetch a PDF. That would be like a binary blob. You can go fetch JSON data and then render that JSON data to the screen. You can go fetch HTML or XML and do whichever you want to do with it. All that is possible with fetch, because fetch just says, go to this URL, make this request, get me back whatever that URL gives me back. And then you decide how to handle it in your JavaScript. And that's the beauty of fetch. And again, there's a good website that practices called JSON Placeholder. Okay, so let me go find the actual page. Okay, JSON Placeholder. So basically, this is like a website that just has some like practice like JSON requests, although there we go. Okay, so if I take this URL, which is going to return me back some dummy data, just to show you one more example, I can just do fetch. Again, I'm going to do fetch that URL. So notice this time I'm not requesting a file that I have in my website. I'm requesting just something from another website through a URL. And I go through the same process. I say .fetch. Okay, I know that this is going to give me back JSON data. Knowing that, I can just again do .then and say, hey, res.json. Now notice this time I didn't write return res.json. Reason being is that when you're using an arrow function, if you don't use curly brackets after the arrow, that means automatically means return. So basically I'm saying, hey, return the result of res.json. And then I can be like .then, and then here we have the data. And if I console.log the data, and I go back here, you can see like there's the data right here. Okay, so there's the data from JSON Placeholder. So I can go get the data from anywhere, and there's a whole world of third-party APIs to work with, like the OMDB API. Every famous website you use probably has an API that you're able to access using things like fetch. Okay, and again, all of that evolved from that AJAX function in jQuery, because the original way, the XML HTTP request, was just kind of a difficult thing to work with. But now, basically working with these types of requests in JavaScript is quite easy. And hopefully this gives you a lot more clarity on sort of what fetch can do and why, and what basically the fact that it unlocks a whole new world of possibilities. Because before, again, I could only use links and forms to send requests, which was very limited. I could do it without writing JavaScript, but it was very limited. Now with fetch, basically anything is possible. I can make any kind of request that I want to any URL. So, and then do whatever I want with whatever that URL gives me back, whether it's swapping out HTML or grabbing JSON data and rendering it to the DOM, whatever I want. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. My name is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. Have a great day and enjoy.